Good evening, Nandan.
Hi, Pramod.
Absolute pleasure. And I've been waiting for this for a long time
Oh my God.
so that I can ask you all the questions publicly, interview. So, welcome. And today we have a fantastic global audience connected in, tuning in to listen to uh, a set of conversations about digital public infrastructure and the impact thereof. And as part of India's journey, we have, at least in few areas, we have been proving this idea works at scale to deal with scale and diversity, and you have been at the helm of all of those efforts. So I'll sort of go through few of the questions, and we can keep the conversation flowing. So in the beginning, the idea of digital public infrastructure, or DPI as it's known today, why should countries bother about this idea at all? Many of them have been on digitization journey since maybe 90s sometimes, or even 2000. Countries have been digitizing parts of the pieces of the e-governance projects, banking, or many other projects. Why now? Why it's DPI? How is it different?
Well, I think DPI, or digital public infrastructure, is different from just digitization or e-government applications. It's actually enabling the creation of an ecosystem using unbundled building blocks, which allows innovation to flourish on top of some fundamental digital rails and infrastructure that you put in. So it's the combination of public-enabled investment in rails, standard interoperable protocols, and market innovators operating on top of that. It's all these three coming together which really define digital public infrastructure.
And so does that, so traditional, let's take an example of a traditional e-gov projects. A government would want to digitize, and they would decide what to do. They would think of a solution, they would put out an RFP and try to build out the whole thing. Are you saying they shouldn't, or they should only build some and then leave innovation? Tell me a little more.
There are some applications where that is more than adequate. I mean, if you want to issue a driver's license or issue a passport, then that application can do the entire thing. But if you want to enable change in a society, if you want to enable massive learning, or you want to create an open discoverable market for jobs, or if you want to enable an interoperable competitive healthcare system, then you have to think DPI. So I think DPI is a larger way of thinking of how you use digital technology to organize a society where you use the full power of digital and you use the full innovative capacity of everyone in society.
The ecosystem. Okay, that's. I think the real difference there is the ability for ecosystem to further continuously innovate.
That's right.
On top of the building blocks or the rails.
Yes.
And
in some sense, that's what the original internet was.
That was it. Yeah.
Original internet was essentially a public system invested by the U.S. government, Department of Defense, which laid the protocols and the stuff with a set of standard ways of, for example, the way you send an email or the way you set up a website was all defined. And then you had huge amount of innovation on top of that.
Absolutely.
So you can take that as a principle and apply it in different sectors.
That's very interesting. So this is the idea of internet itself, in one sense. It's public rails and private innovation. Does there is some, maybe because of the hunger by which some of the developing nations move faster in digitization because we are leapfrogging. But the idea of DPI, is it restricted to or relevant only to developing nations?
Oh, I think DPI as a way of thinking applies to all sectors for all nations, whether they are developing or developed. For example, going forward, the whole world is dealing with the whole climate crisis.
Absolutely.
And the world is going to spend billions of dollars in energy transition and many other things they have never done before. DPI, there's a very huge role for DPI in the climate transition.
Excellent.
Whether it's energy or whatever. So I think DPI as a concept is applicable to all sectors across all countries. Of course, in the global south, it has a huge play because of the leapfrogging ability that countries don't have legacy systems, and often legacy systems end up becoming
in the way.
impediment to that. So countries like India and many others can leapfrog by doing greenfield DPI in a way that creates more profound implication, impact. That is true, but I think DPI theory applies to everyone.
And also, I think your earlier point about DPI is about allowing market innovation. So I think unlike digitization, government digitization, where the marketplace looked at it as some, it's good to have for citizens, it's necessary, but it's not where the market really played out. I think DPI brought the best of both.
That's right.
Into the picture, and hence even more relevant to countries where the marketplace may be traditionally solving larger problems, government may be only, minimally regulating.
It's also about harnessing the entire productive capacities of a society, right? So obviously, government has certain capacity, government has certain intent, government has scale. There's some things governments can do well. There's some things that social and civil society can do well. They can, help. And there's something markets can do well. So well-defined, well-designed DPI ecosystem enables all players to do their job well and collectively bring in innovation and solutioning in a way that actually large societal issues are solved.
And I'm also thinking this approach then also allows evolvability. The sense that since we don't know the future, we never predicted COVID, resilience to an unknown future, also because we are not upfront designing what the solution ought to be.
Absolutely. Actually, that's very true. It's not solutions. It's actually the ability to solve at different times. And I call this optionality a strategy. In other words, strategy is not about saying, how do we get to A or how do we get to B? Strategy is about saying, whatever happens, I should be able to do A or B. That's optionality. And a good example is for example, the whole platforming we did of direct benefit transfer. Direct benefit transfer is used, say, to give pensions and scholarships and so on. But in an emergency, the DBT can be used to give emergency money, as India gave to 160 million beneficiaries, spending $4.5 billion during COVID. Or tomorrow, if you want to create a more you want to do climate adaptation, and you want to give anticipatory financing to people to strengthen their homes, you can do that through DBT, and so on and so forth. So when you build these as application agnostic building blocks, then different users will emerge, some of which I can't anticipate.
Very good.
But if you do it well, then you can use it for that
option
purpose.
A or option B. Lovely.
So I think of it as optionality as strategy.
That's lovely. That actually takes us, your DBT point takes us to the next question. Obviously, these are evolved over the last 12 years as you were in the thick of implementing digital public infrastructure in India. Can you take us 14 years, 13, 14, 2009 to be precise. Can you just give the audience a quick overview of what went down, what happened in the last 13 years?
Well, obviously, our understanding and of the DPI nuances have evolved over these 14 years. But I think when we began the Aadhaar project, and you were, Pramod, very much part of the founding team, I think we knew some things. We wanted it to be at population scale. We wanted it to be low cost.
Ecosystem.
We wanted to be ecosystem play, so enrollment ecosystem, training ecosystem, device ecosystem, usage ecosystem, etc. We wanted it to be inclusive, so everybody should be able to participate.
And hence simplicity.
So minimalism in design. We didn't want to make it. We realized that if we make it very complex, it'll fall under its own weight. So keeping it simple, by the way, was the most difficult. Everybody said, why don't you add a blood group? Why don't you add some income level and all? We had to keep it simple. And then opening it up. But I think the critical thing was one realization that we should obviously provide a very strong use case for governments, because that's why governments are investing in this.
Absolutely.
But also create an open architecture which allows tomorrow's market innovators to use.
Yeah.
And seeing that forward was an important consideration in our architecture
When we started
and
with
strategy.
Aadhaar,
Yeah.
And then what shifted in 2015 when Digital India, the next set of building blocks, was it natural?
Well, I think, initially with Aadhaar, we had Aadhaar itself, we had Aadhaar
Aadhaar
authentication,
payment,
we had eKYC, and then we had
Early days of
DBT,
yeah.
where we could put money into people's accounts because that was part of the.
correct.
But I think 2015, Digital India, Prime Minister Modi came and announced Digital India in 2015. I think the layering about that began. For example, with you and Ram Sevak, you worked on e-sign for digital signatures, DigiLocker. There were other layers added, and because of architecture, you could layer these things on. And DBT demonstrated financial inclusion at scale.
Yeah.
And so I think the one thing we realize is that in a public situation where the government is a player, you can't, and if it's going to be a multi-year thing, any transformation is decades. You can't do everything at the same time. So but importantly, you have to design in a way that each layer can talk to the next layer and so on and so forth. And over time, all these things combine and create new possibilities.
Yeah, and then we, of course, went on to do UPI.
Yeah.
Very, very, interestingly, 2013, the discussion began.
I think the first
2014.
conversation on UPI, Dilip, you, me, we had it in 2013.
Yeah.
And there, of course, I think we want to catch the digital payment wave.
Right time.
And it took us 3 years to get it out, and it only got released in 2016, May.
Yeah.
So, one thing we have learned is that these DPIs take years to conceptualize, build, roll out, scale. But once they reach a particular scale and momentum, then they just take off.
Did you know demonetization was coming? No. When you launched UPI?
But 2016, in my view, was a seminal year in DPI. And I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
In April 4th, 2016, India reached 1 billion Aadhaars. When I stepped down from UIDAI in March of 2014, it had reached 600 million or something. And then, of course, after Prime Minister Modi, Digital India, they got a big push. So 1 billion Aadhaars reached on April 4th, 2016. April 11, 2016,
Yes.
UPI was launched. It's a big coincidence.
Yeah.
Exactly a week later in Mumbai. September 5th, 2016 was the launch of Jio. So that led to the whole telecom, massive lowering of data costs and all that. November 8, 2016 was the withdrawal of currency notes, so-called demonetization. So all these events happened in 2016. And also in 2016, when we had the first meeting with the Reserve Bank, where the idea of using account aggregator as an empowerment platform began. So this was a seminal year in the history of India's DPI.
That's a lot.
And we didn't know it at that time.
And but those launches and decisions are such profound and long-term impact. And we are still figuring out the data impact and so on, right?
We're still early days on that.
Yeah. So, it's a good question to ask. You've always been the visionary. You foresee at least your patterns in your mind form much ahead of time. Did you see a lot of this coming through in the pipe? When did you start seeing? Maybe 2016, around that?
Yeah. I think obviously we saw the Aadhaar patterns much earlier.
Yeah.
We visualized UPI earlier.
Yeah.
But in 2016, I think all these stuff started coming together.
Yeah.
And I think the full power of the impact
DPIs,
was visible. And in fact, I gave many talks in 2016 on this topic, saying this is likely to happen. So I think 2016 we saw all the stuff coming together.
Yeah. So it's hard to get one project right. I mean, most projects fail. It's very, very hard. And that's also at scale to get it right. India seemed to be pulling off at least, quite like few other countries as well, but India repeating the pattern. Forget the tech part. Assuming that's easy because, some of us find tech easy. But I assume architecture, you got it right. What what really happened in India? What were the what came together, right, for India to be able to repeat this population scale success again and again and again? And it's not even controlled by centrally one team.
No, I think India now, there is a broad, strong consensus across all the leaderships that digital public infrastructure is the way to go for development. I mean, right from the government, Prime Minister Modi and his colleagues, they're fully committed to a digital architecture. We have many people in the bureaucracy who have worked on this, who are extremely, and many of them were engineers. If you go back to 1977, 78, the IAS entrance exam was expanded, opened up for engineers and doctors. Till then, it's all you had to do some liberal arts stuff. So that opened up, people like Ram Seva came from IIT and joined the IAS and so on. So I think the bureaucracy, I think the massive technological outsourcing industry of India, which $250 billion, 5 million people, gave a lot of the talent who were willing to repurpose their talent to work for solving India's large challenges. And then the whole startup, 100,000 startups.
Of course,
So I think it was a very unique environment. That was why the environment made it possible. So today, if you go with a new idea, people believe it will happen, like ONDC will happen, stuff like that. So that's. But many societies don't have that acceptance of new ideas and the belief that these new things using technology will make a difference. Belief is very important. Apart from that, I think all of us collectively have a playbook now on how to make it happen. So the one is getting the broad consensus leadership motivation, but it's also about having a playbook. So I think because we have done many of these, we now have patterns, and we know what that pattern is. How do you collaborate? How do you create open source stacks? How do you create deployment strategies? How do you create networks? How do you create ecosystems? How do you get everybody involved? Incentive alignment. So there's a lot of playbook things, and that playbook can be repeated. So it's a broad consensus, strong leadership across business, politics, bureaucracy, and belief
plus
and playbooks.
So all three things have come together. And success breeds success. I think countries have to believe that something magical can happen, at scale can happen, and I think tend to repeat more and more.
You can see that, right? I mean, today, everybody says we are the UPI of X.
Correct.
Right? So ONDC is the UPI of commerce. Now, everybody says, UPI of commerce. So if UPI is 350 million people, 9 billion transactions, what is this going to be? Or you'll say honest is the UPI of skilling, or whatever. The point is that now mental models have been set, which are now, people are willing to accept that this can happen in some other sector.
Actually, those mental models are very key, and the first belief, initial early success is very, very key.
That's right.
I think countries who are in this journey must very much focus on, instead of trying to do everything else, get one success, because it sets the belief.
Slice the problem.
And this brings back also an interesting point. While Aadhaar did play out ecosystem, as you said, device ecosystem, accepting party, identity accepting party ecosystem, by the time we got to, UPI, it was purely a market-driven ecosystem. And now we see that with account aggregator and ONDC and everything else, right? Where the government is playing only interoperability game and some governance, lightweight governance to ensure protection, consumer protection, safety of money, and things like that. But otherwise, on top of that, the entire innovation, competitive market, just to speak about DPI's ability, and what did India learn from that? From the market economy being shifted through DPI.
So I think we have to go back and
Which didn't happen much with Aadhaar discussion.
No, but see, I think Aadhaar had to be a government project.
Sovereign
because
identity.
it had to be a sovereign role, because you're giving an ID to people, and ID is a very emotive topic, it's a very sensitive topic. So it has to be government-led, and I think that was the right thing. But architecturally, it was used for government use cases like DBT, and it was enabled for private use cases. I think using the Aadhaar eKYC as a foundation led to the massive growth of mobile inclusion done by Jio and others, Airtel, Idea, Vodafone, all that, and banking inclusion done both by government, the whole Jandan Yojana program of the Prime Minister, which led to a few 100 million bank accounts being opened, and by market operators, because a lot of new bank licenses were given, payment banks, Airtel Payments Bank, Postal Payment Bank, or Small Finance Bank, Ujjivan, all that. So there it was both government push in terms of bank account opening as well as market push. So all these three things, again, 2016 was a good year to think about coming together. So suddenly you could see a world where everybody had a digital ID, everybody had a bank account, everybody had a mobile smartphone usable across the country. All these three things. That, and all available as interoperable APIs. That then laid the foundation for massive market innovation.
And that's where I think, again, DPI brings both inclusion agenda and innovation agenda rather than at the crossroads.
Absolutely. I think people always thought of markets as somewhere where you make profits for the top people, and inclusion, some CSR, social kind of thing, two different things. What we have demonstrated here is that if you create digitally enabled, inclusive railroads, which are very high volume, very low cost, or free to use, designed for inclusion, you can actually use market momentum and also achieve universal. I mean, you could not have imagined 350 million people are making payments. You can't imagine that you're walking on the streets and you buy a coconut for 50 rupees and you pay with UPI. You can't imagine that the driver charges his toll with FASTag. It's there, everybody. So I think so I think it's important to think of using digital technology to bridge the gap between markets and inclusion.
Okay, and that gives you sustainable scale. Otherwise, you have to keep funding in one sense, right? Sustainability is key.
And also universality is very important, because otherwise what happens is if we segregate into markets and just purely public thing, the people who are in the public system have no voice. So those tend to there's no
because
voice.
We don't use it.
Because the well-to-do have their own solution. Private school, private everything, private power, their own generator, all that, gated communities and all that. So I think by making our digital infrastructure used by everyone, the fact that the well-to-do guy is using it to buy an airline ticket, and the vegetable vendor is using it to sell vegetables or coconuts, now makes it much more customer-driven. So everybody gets good service.
And accountability and all
you
that.
Get good service.
Good service.
Otherwise it was not happening.
Free thing for poor people, why bother? Right, that's an excellent point. I think when you bring markets there and everybody starts using in the society, and the overall quality of service and accountability goes up. And this brings us to, sectoral DPI conversation, which we always have sometimes difficulty in discussing. DPI generic, sectoral. And Rohini, you and Shankar co-founded Extra Foundation in 2015. And tell us about, I think it was audacious. It's easy to set up audacious because you say that all the time, but you set up a very audacious goal at that time in 2015. And tell us about the first 5-year journey of Extra Foundation. And what did you learn from that Extra's education journey in the first 5 years?
Well, when we started in 2015, we had just come off the Aadhaar experience.
Correct.
Many of us had worked on Aadhaar, and some of us were also advisors to NPCI and UP and all. So we were reasonably in that space of, but XSTEP was really a non-profit philanthropic venture to address the challenge of education at scale. Because one thing that I think we all knew was that human capital of a nation is key to its success. And if we don't, going back to the whole access thing, if we can give access to 200 million children to the best learning opportunity, then they can't be anything better than that. So that's what drove us to do that. And I think in the first 5 years, working with the government, Diksha and so on, I think a lot of the access issues were addressed. And that only got a bigger push during the pandemic. So I think we learned how to solve access at scale. in a society which has huge diversity,
Yeah.
so many languages, so many school boards, you have to deal with a lot of, it's not like it's not one central system. Like Aadhaar was one system for the whole country, so you could do it. But this requires the architecture to be malleable to handle diversity. So that's what I think we learned in the first 5 years. And that was very successful in getting access out.
Access out. And also, it was because the school education is lot more organized and sort of, while it's not central control, but it's still very organized. Textbooks and school and curriculum and so on, right? I think there was a Diksha, for example, address diversity and scale towards access, not necessarily towards outcome yet, but that access is important first step towards outcome.
You have to get access digitally and all that.
Without access, outcome won't happen
And
anyway.
also it is important to put the rails.
Yeah, yes.
For example, today the whole QR codes.
Yes, yeah.
Now, India has 600 million textbooks that are printed every year in the public education system. And by putting in an average of 20 QR codes per textbook, which have a digital address between your device and the topic, we have 12 billion QR codes in India today, which I can use to now connect.
Open up access. Yeah.
Connect. And then once we have innovation there, the sky is the limit on what can happen. So I think thinking through the rails also is very important.
And a QR code as a rail to move from physical to digital. Phygital.
The crossover thing.
Crossover was a brilliant strategy there as well. But even then, we realized if you slightly go outside the school education area, very, very key issues facing across the world today. Many of the global listeners are listening. Skilling, high school dropouts, the youth skilling. And now with AI, it's not even a youth problem, skilling. You and I have to keep skilling all the time.
Yeah.
So, but that is much more fragmented, unorganized, no curriculum thereof, what you want to learn. Talk about what XTEP is doing with the network thinking, trust, verifiable credential. What are you thinking about?
Totally. So I think let's look at it in 2-3 different aspects. First is Diksha, enabled by Sunbird, set the access issues, right? At the formal education.
Education. Yeah.
Now, in that area, the challenge is how do we go from access to outcomes?
Yeah.
And how do we use AI to make learning more possible?
Yeah.
So the only friction to learning should be motivation. Everything else should be available.
Yeah.
And I think some of the work we're doing there, like what we're doing on the language stuff, is about using AI to make learning outcomes better.
Yeah.
So that's a huge one. If you can get that right, then that means actually learning outcomes will improve for millions of people.
Very much.
The second thing is, how do we take this beyond formal education to lifelong education or adult education or just-in-time education? I need to learn a skill, etc. Because India is going to go through a massive formalization, right? People are going to move from villages to cities. They're going to be going from working on farms to working in the service industry or manufacturing. They're going from being illiterate to literate, going from not using machines to using many transitions happening. And all these transitions are further accelerated because AI is going to accelerate the removal of some jobs and the creation of new jobs. Which means lifelong, continuous learning at speed is the only game in town. And therefore, if you can use this and use network thinking and the work we've done on protocols with Beacon and so on, to create an interoperable system both for discovery of jobs, but discovery of content, discovery of new ways to get skills.
Indeed.
Then you're creating an agile society where people, as long as they're motivated, can learn new things to keep pace in this fast-paced world.
Fantastic. And I think the disruptions of AI, disruptions thereof, and the new economic, the idea of labor and productivity is changing into micro-entrepreneurship, and the tool sets I need to survive in the new world requires continuous education. So the real question we are asking, if that's only game in town, I think you are now asking is that can And one platform cannot solve all this problem. So how do you create a network effect by many people coming together, offering access to finance, access to courses, learning, jobs, internships, apprenticeship,
Totally.
in a network world.
Yeah, and that's what the honest
That's
thing
what
is all
honest is
about.
all about, yeah.
And I think this is absolutely super critical. And it's only, so we have to think of AI in two ways, or three ways. One is AI is the cause of this acceleration. So everybody has to learn faster, better. AI can also be used to facilitate this acceleration.
Indeed. Yes.
So I can have learning tutors and so on.
Yeah.
And AI can also be used to make this disaggregated network more efficient by improving the ability of discovery and matching and so on.
That's
so there are many
fantastic. Many
dimensions
elements
to
of it.
this.
And of course, then AI, as we are doing with at Extra Foundation, with our Bhashini effort,
Yeah, and then
the
there's
interactions
the whole,
thereof.
Yeah, and the interaction.
At human
I think
scale.
interaction again is multiple parts
Yeah.
to it. One is how do we make interactions in your own language, which is what Bhashini AI for Bharat does. So I can interact in Hindi.
Yeah.
But how do I make it using voice?
Voice.
So I don't need to use a keyboard or touch screen. I can speak. So if I can speak to the device, which is either assisted or self-service, in Hindi, then I've suddenly opened up inclusion at scale. Massively.
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. The other is how do I use AI to make complex interactions easy? So if a farmer wants to understand what should he do for his particular farming problem, how can he ask it and get answers in a way he can consume and solve his problem?
GPT or on steroids,
Whatever-
but very well controlled.
Yeah, but whatever,
no
some
hallucinations.
LLM behind it.
Yeah, LLM behind. Yeah.
So that's I think very important. And third is how do we use AI to harness tacit knowledge, which is now in the heads of people.
Yeah.
So maybe for that farmer,
Very
the
interesting.
most relevant example may not be something coming out of necessarily a research lab.
Institute.
It may be another farmer
right
who has solved it in his own way, who talks about it, and this guy, the second farmer, gets access to it.
That's very
So can we leverage community knowledge to make each other more productive? And Apurva does that.
Yeah, it's brilliant. In fact, a lot of us have thought about why is the knowledge not coming out. I think the capture of knowledge in an organized way, it's very high cost.
Yeah.
Someone has to convert it traditionally into textbooks and printing material, PDFs. But if your native knowledge is a native language, is a native voice, which you already understand, the dissemination thereof, the knowledge could be much more natural to
I think
human
we
beings.
can do that. So in some sense, our networks and protocols like Beacon are connecting informal networks to create virtual aggregated markets. AI and all this is going to aggregate informal knowledge to be more useful to every participant. So
Make it
one is
knowledge
knowledge, one
accessible
is
and interaction access open. Wow, this is opportunities are plenty for sure. I want to take a couple of more questions. I know we are conscious of time. Many countries, many global leaders are listening today. Many countries are obviously during the journey. But you talked about packaging earlier, the playbook. You talked about initial success, but the playbook. If we truly want to see 75 to 100 countries adopting their own journey via DPI approach, building their own DPIs, many things such as capacity, capital, and ecosystem all need to be in place. How are you seeing the packaging thereof of ingredients and the recipes, including capital, capacity? How do these countries, how can they compress? Rather than going through 2-3 decades.
In fact, we have, as you know, there's a global movement afoot to do 50 countries in 5 years, which is an aggressive schedule. But the reason is that if the world has to get to the SDGs by 2030, we have to accelerate things. We have lost 2 years because of the pandemic. So I think that's very much required. So you have to package everything. How do you deploy? How do you roll out? How do you procure? How do you teach? How do you everything? Governance. What are the laws you have to write? What are the regulations? All that can be packaged so that all you need now is political will and consensus in the leadership of a country to take this forward. Everything else is in the menu.
And the capacity and capability,
And
where does that come from?
Yeah, capacity has to come. All countries may not have the unique situation of having 5 million people in the country doing IT work.
Sure.
So we are lucky in that sense.
Yeah.
But certainly capacity can come internally or from global players.
Yeah.
I think that can be tackled. It is really, think of it this way. 14 years back, DPI was an unknown. Today, DPI is a known.
Yeah.
So we have actually simplified, de-skilled, and brought out a whole body of knowledge in some sense.
Yeah.
Which now it's about using this, and you can do it much faster.
Creating their own journey.
And the playbooks.
And their own success. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a necessary, and capital, I presume, it's available.
Capital
right?
will come.
It will always come.
Because this is not, as we always say, this is not an issue of needing deep pockets.
Okay.
It's about having deep conviction.
Excellent, yeah.
Because when I look at the world's challenges, to get the climate transition will cost, the people say $3-4 trillion a year.
Yeah.
$3-4 trillion a year.
Yeah.
Whereas a DPI-led transformation is nowhere in that cost range. So there's plenty of capital in the world, because this is the highest bang for the buck.
Because DPI, you don't have to do the whole thing. You have to do only the minimum thing that allows the market.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
It's not a money thing at all.
Yeah, it's not a money thing. And so what does the next 5-10 years look at, especially given facing climate issues, energy transition, skilling and livelihood continues to haunt people. How are you seeing what interesting things are unraveling? I spoke about AI and few things, but what else are you seeing?
No, I think it's all these AI, DPIs, open networks, beacon protocol, all coming together to create a new model of economic growth, which is demonstrated in India, to be taken around the world to create better economic growth, more sustainable green growth, and a more inclusive growth where everybody participates.
Indeed.
So if you can get sustainable, inclusive, green growth,
wow, okay,
and thereby, and combining the fact that we have ways to think about both using market power as well as inclusion, also using this to drive sustainable development goals. I think that's
what we should
possible,
focus on. Absolutely possible. It looks like it is a very much a possibility if we put our heads together. Yeah. So before we end, what will be one thing that you want to tell the people? What do you want one thing people to take away today from global leaders who are listening today?
Well, I think DPI is an idea whose time has come. And DPI is a huge bang for the buck. And if you want the world to be a better place, a more inclusive place, a cleaner place, a less hotter place, then I think we need to think about applying DPI at scale.
More equity, inclusion, yes.
Around the world ASAP. And I think all the knowledge is there, we just have to get cracking.
Just execute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Nandan.
Thanks, Pramod. Thank you so much.
I'm very sure the audience has a lot of takeaway.
I hope so.
We look forward to more conversations.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.